Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
First of all, good evening to everyone, and I'd especially like to thank the Veritas Forum and the Veritas organization, and especially those who were responsible for making this event happen, and for all of the individuals who work behind the scenes, those who don't get the glory and the appreciation. I want you to know that your work and your efforts are certainly well appreciated. And so with that, I'm tasked with the responsibility to discuss seeing the possible dream. And before I offer my thoughts, my truth, which is just that, my truth, I'd like to begin by singing a bar or two of a song that I think will work to underscore my theme. Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrows. Nobody knows the troubles I've seen, but glory, hallelujah. In keeping with half of the title for this evening's program, I wish to begin with the level of optimism. Allow me, if you would, to take the following liberty. As I see it, the question is not, is the dream really possible? Instead, I think the question that burns within each of us this evening might ask us to fathom, how are we to live it? I offer this interrogative amendment because I suspect those who have been saved by the perfecting work of Jesus the Christ well know the Savior has charged us with the new commandment to love one another just as he has loved us. In this same passage from the book of John, we are also admonished to love one another, for by this all people will know that we are his disciples. Testing our capacity to love even further, we are asked in another scriptural verse, if you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. Thus, we find we are even charged to love our enemies. Tonight, I wish to offer insights on a different kind of love, one that would serve as a foundation for our individual faith walks in the spirit of ethnic diversity. Permit me to name this Christian attribute as visionary love. I'd like to think of this visionary love as a kind of faith-based affection that deliberately takes the time to see and acknowledge all humans, however different they may be according to our physical eyesight, as brothers and sisters. I'd further submit that this visionary love must be daily exercised if we hope to enter God's kingdom. For once again, Scripture speaks to us in ways that heroically challenge the way we may have been socialized to think from our various epistemological frameworks. And for those of you who don't know, epistemological is one of those fancy Scrabble words that just simply means the ways, the processes of knowledge and the ways of knowing knowledge. John 4:20 instructs, if a man say, I love God and hateth his brother, whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen. Quite simply, we are being told that it is impossible to love an invisible God when we can so casually hate, mistreat, malign, and abuse those who we can see down here on earth. This scriptural passage immediately came to mind shortly after I accepted the invitation to speak on this subject pertaining to multiculturalism and ethnic diversity, because I was instantly reminded of all the little things that occur on this campus on any given day that reiterate for me my invisibility to others as I navigate this campus. In fact, the more I think on these connections between Scripture, ethnic diversity, and the visionary love I am advocating, the more I come to realize just how achievable the dream of achieving ethnic diversity here in Durham, New Hampshire can be. Two things are in order before I begin itemizing these little things that daily connote my invisibility on this campus. First, I would say that this journey through my experience ought to inspire us to greater action as opposed to paralyzing us into shame. That is, we need not suffer from despair, thinking that the task of actualizing ethnic diversity on this campus is too daunting or too heroic of a task to ever be achieved. Rather, I believe we can find solace in the lessons these little things teach us. Essentially, the little things we do from this day forward can have monumental effects on the world at large if we would only dare to see ethnic difference and greet it with a smile. The second point that I feel needs to be made has to do with my upbringing. You should know that my mother, Shirley Ann Wilburn Best, and she calls herself the best woman from South Florida, you should know that she was a major influence on my formative years. She was raised in South Carolina from the 1940s through the early 60s on a sharecropping farm, and during a time when her father, my grandfather, could not enter the establishment of a business through the front door, where schools were racially segregated and black students in her hometown were educated through secondhand books that white schools in Aiken County discarded. In fact, you need to know that even though Brown versus Board of Education was passed back in the 50s, it wasn't until 1971, the year that my mother's youngest sister entered her senior year of high school, that public schools in Aiken County were racially integrated. I mention these details because I want you to know that though my parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents daily lived through these traumatic experiences, it never compromised their faith to the point where they lost a religious sense of respect for good manners. Thus, I was raised to look folk in their eyes when I spoke to them. I was instructed to greet others when navigating public spaces, to hold doors for people entering buildings behind me, and to use words like please, thank you, and excuse me when interfacing with all types of people, black and white, and everything else. But on any given day on this campus, I am bound to feel the sentiments expressed by Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in the prologue of that novel. I walk past a multitude of whites who never seem to see me when I pass their way. In public spaces on this campus, it is not uncommon that some white person mistakenly, and I put a question mark there, bumps up against me as though I'm an obstacle in their path without so much as an excuse me or apology for the physical offense committed against me. At other times, when the courtesy of an excuse me is uttered, I often get the sense that the words are more of a trivial formality than a petition that asks me to politely step aside. Before I can even step aside, the rude individual has often already walked through me, sometimes even stepping on my foot, which really tests my righteous indignation since chances are I'm wearing a fierce pair of footwear. Yet another manifestation of this manner of visual impairment plays itself through the contortionist gymnastics I often witness white passersby performing as they attempt to maneuver around me without ever saying, "Excuse me." Please know that I would politely oblige them if they had only signaled that they were approaching my direction and needed to get by. A final example I will share with you around this visual impairment has to do with the rudeness I encounter when I hold the doors open for others. I can't tell you how many times I've held the door open for others as a simple gesture of courtesy without receiving a thank you from them. It's as if it was understood that it was my duty and my job to perform the service. I'd also want you to know that I almost never experience this dynamic with people of color. So when the offending person is white, I find myself getting indignant deep within because I never really know whether this instance is simply a product of rudeness or something more insidious. At the very least, each of these incidents that I'm likely to experience on any given day in Durham, New Hampshire, clearly reiterate my invisibility. As a black male who entered this world having inherited the U.S. legacy of racial conflict, I can no more discard these daily affronts to my being and my existence as merely coincidental, trivial, or of no consequence at all. In truth, we all live in a world where racism, ethnic insensitivity, ignorance, and sometimes rose-colored ideologies impact each of us, both blatantly and covertly, and on macro and micro levels of structural oppression. So when ethnic students, faculty, and staff encounter rudeness and impoliteness on campus, I'd like to suggest that the potential for reading those gestures as rooted in racial ethnic insensitivity is a logical interpretation that may in many times be informed by lives within the illuminating veil of one's double consciousness. Whenever I encounter these dynamics of racial invisibility on campus, I am always irked to frustration and indignation. Indeed, for me, it is a very painful dynamic, having been raised in a society or in a family where the image and linguistic sign of blackness is denigrated to inspire fear in others, all the while connoting something negative in dominant culture's psyche. Given that legacy, it is even more painful to be raised to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, to learn to treat others as you'd like to be treated, only to be mistreated and disrespected in kind. I believe that one thing all of us in this room can do to effect change and sustain a healthy approach to actualizing the dream of multiculturalism is learning to see the beauty of difference. This little gesture is a manageable project. If we dare to see, the practice could yield major dividends. I'd like to think that the major dividend is that of perfecting our ability to love one another, even as we love ourselves. In my mind, that is a sure foundation upon which we all can build as we daily make our way to the mountaintop, fortified by the faith and wonder of a visionary Christianity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be part of the Veritas Forum this evening. I wish I could follow in the footsteps of Dr. Wilburn. When I was a young boy, my ambition was actually to be a nightclub singer. But that ambition was aborted pretty early on. I hope that what I have to say this evening is not going to detract from the powerful and moving words of Dr. Wilburn. I live in a country that has been torn apart by a bloody civil war which lasted over 30 years and saw more than 100,000 people killed. It's a war that was misleadingly referred to in the international media as an ethnic conflict. While the war came to an end about 18 months ago, none of the underlying issues and grievances have been addressed by the current ruling regime in Sri Lanka. Unlike in the United States, societies in South and Southeast Asia have been home to countless ethnic, religious, and tribal communities, many of which were only united into modern nation states by colonial administrations. Excepting First Nations people and African Americans, the US is a relatively new immigrant society, and most of your recent immigrants have come to your shores voluntarily. There are very different moral and political challenges we face when addressing the needs of immigrant groups and addressing the needs of those we have either coercively displaced or brought into relations of servitude. Moreover, I can take you to cities on the Indian subcontinent where neighboring communities simply cannot speak to each other in a shared language. And that's what makes what is called multiculturalism in the United States rather tepid by comparison. In many of these countries, there is a lively debate over the nature of the national community, over what we take the word we, or we the people, to refer to. The complexity of our South and Southeast Asian societies, which are fractured along several axes of class, ethnicity, gender, caste, and so on, and sometimes along more than one axis simultaneously, means that people are often multiply disadvantaged. And that's one reason why criticisms of the political process that are based purely on Marxist or feminist lines have proved to be so inadequate. While toleration is an important political value, it's equally important to understand that cultural or ethnic groups do not interact with each other on a level playing field. Purely anthropological approaches to cultures occlude from view the actual political, historical, and economic conditions within which groups define their identities or have identities ascribed to them or even imposed on them by dominant others. So the achievement of civic rights only goes halfway. Groups that have been disempowered over several generations require substantial transfers of resources. Even if politically all citizens are defined as equal, the presence of social relations of exploitation, often overlapping with sharp economic disparities, makes it impossible for people to exercise their citizenship rights. This is the current situation even in several Western liberal democracies, notably the US. Formally, everyone enjoys equal rights of citizenship, and this is important. But materially, there are large cumulative inequalities when it comes to education, organizational power, or income. Such societies are effectively class divided. In Victorian England, Benjamin Disraeli, a British Prime Minister, warned of the division of Britain into, quote, two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets. End of quote. Similarly, Alexis de Tocqueville, writing around the same time as Disraeli, warned that the greatest threat to America's fledgling democracy lay in the greed of the mercantile class. Gross economic inequalities destroy social solidarity and subvert democratic participation. Wherever we happen to live in the world, we know that those who have more resources at their disposal are able to manipulate public policy in their favor at the expense of those with fewer resources. That's why noisy factories are cited and toxic waste dumped not in the affluent suburbs and the gated condominiums of the rich, but in those places where the least well-off live and work. Inequality kills because it affects public policy. It alters the distribution of education, healthcare, environmental protection, and other material resources. So the universal availability of education, healthcare, and basic welfare provisions, and unrestricted access to information enable people to exercise their citizenship rights. And if we add to these the willingness on the part of governments to consult regularly those whose lives are affected by their decisions, then we would have a more participatory democracy based on an informed citizenry equipped to call its democratically elected leaders to account. I want now to share some insights or observations that I have drawn from my experience of living in a conflict-ridden society, and I invite you to translate these insights into your situation here in the USA. First, difference alone does not lead to violent conflict. Ethnic conflicts are not the result of ancient hatreds or unbridgeable cultural differences. It's when differences are used to claim superiority over others or to justify political or economic discrimination against others that difference now turns into violent conflict. Complex as the threads are that led to the terrible bloodshed in Sri Lanka, if I were to identify the principal factor, it is poor governance, coupled with the lack of political statesmanship. No political party or leader has had the courage to articulate and promote an inclusive national narrative that gave people of all linguistic, cultural, or religious identities a sense that they belong as equal citizens of the country. Any notion of a common good swiftly fragmented into various sectional interests. Politicians on all sides manipulated and were manipulated by the most strident voices in their respective ethnic and religious communities. The second observation. All of us are formed as human persons by what we have experienced, including sufferings that we have borne. Victims often remember in a way that nurses resentment, even hatred, stirring up deep longings for revenge. Such bitter memories are what often fuel long-standing conflict, as families and communities pass on stories of suffering to future generations. Individuals and entire communities can become so obsessed with their memories of wrongs inflicted that they even define themselves in terms of victimhood. They become paralyzed by their past. But we are not simply shaped by our memories. We ourselves select, interpret, and shape those memories. We are more than what we have suffered, and we can choose to refuse to let them define our future. Our personal and collective identities cannot consist simply in what we have suffered. This is why we should remember truthfully. The Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf, who teaches at Yale, has argued that to remember truthfully is to render justice both to the victim and to the victimizer or the wrongdoer. Wolf writes, I quote, "Seekers of truth, as distinct from alleged possessors of truth, will employ double vision. They will give others the benefit of the doubt, they will inhabit imaginatively the world of others, and they will endeavor to view events in question from the perspective of others and not just their own." End of quote. Thirdly, the biblical understanding of sin gives us unique insights into the nature of human conflict. Sin is a theological concept before it is a moral one. It signifies a rejection of God's call to loving friendship with himself. We make ourselves and our desires the center of things. And trapped in such aspirations to deity, we see others as competitors to be suppressed, or as simply means to further our own ends, or as threats to our well-being. We have an innate bias towards defending and promoting our own interests. Consequently, we tend to speak of the wrongs that we have suffered at the hands of others, but very rarely of the wrongs that we have ourselves done to others. The literary critic, Professor Alan Jacob, writes of the Nobel laureate and Russian dissident, the late Alexander Solzhenitsyn, "It was the Gulag that taught Solzhenitsyn that everyone has the capacity to become a Stalin." And Solzhenitsyn himself wrote, "The line separating good and evil passes not between states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart." The gospel of a crucified God who becomes a victim of human sin offers men and women not only forgiveness, but a change of heart. Indeed, it is a change of heart that enables us to love both personal enemies and those whom our ethnic community stigmatizes as not one of us. Having experienced the gracious embrace of God, we can deal graciously with others. And this is where your experience of Martin Luther King is of global relevance. King's struggle for racial equality was not only a matter of seeking justice for the black community. His vision embraced the liberation of white communities. It was a vision of justice that aimed at eventual reconciliation, what King called beloved community, reconciliation between white and black. This was no cheap forgiveness or shallow reconciliation. It was grounded in a specific biblical and theological tradition. "I am many things to many people," King said of himself in 1965. "But in the quiet recesses of my heart, I'm fundamentally a Baptist preacher. This is my being, my heritage. For I'm also the son of a Baptist preacher, the grandson of a Baptist preacher, and the great-grandson of a Baptist preacher." He didn't use biblical language simply because it was pragmatic to do so in the South. But his vision of social transformation was deeply shaped by a biblical vision of the justice of the kingdom of God. And the black churches of the civil rights movement did not relinquish their specific theological commitments when the student volunteers arrived, many of whom were not Christian. But they found ways of including new friends in their worship without erasing the real differences between them. Charles Marsh of the University of Virginia writes of those days, "When the movement lost its anchor in the church, it began to splinter into activist groups whose spiritual visions were no larger than concerns for their own flourishing. And this proved devastating, since people are not inclined towards social relocation, economic redistribution, or racial reconciliation unless they see their own life stories in a larger theological narrative." It's out of genuine public conversations, public dialogue, that a multiculturally constituted public culture can emerge, along with our specific religious, and cultural particularities. Such a public culture can never be imposed by the state or the dominant community. It can only come from below. But one of the important functions of the state at both national and local levels is to foster the social conditions that make such conversations possible. Some of these conditions are legislative. For example, equal protection for all under the law, fair judicial sentencing procedures, and penal reform. But most will have to do with the way that civil society institutions are run. For example, a fair and responsible media to which members of all communities have access. Schools and universities which are non-sectarian, where all communities learn to discover each other's rich cultural resources and freely interact with one another. Finally, all cultural groups in a pluralistic society, whether they be considered religious or secular, must challenge its members to be self-critical, to develop what Hannah Arendt called enlarged mentalities, so that while not called upon to surrender their core convictions that they may hold, they must still be called to practice an empathetic appreciation of other viewpoints. Whether groups can nurture such sensibilities in their members is a good test of how much they can contribute to public life and the common good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is your opportunity to ask each other a question or two, or if not, I'll ask one. But let's see, Dr. Ramachandra, is there a question you have for Dr. Wilburn or something you'd like him to elaborate on?
Yes, I was very encouraged that you began by talking about the little things that we can do in our civil interactions with one another, and I think this is something that many academics forget. They talk about the big issues, but they don't even know who cleans their offices every day. They don't have any personal relationship with the janitor in their department. And I think it's very important that especially people of faith do not separate the personal from the political. I have majored on the political questions, so I'm very grateful that he began with stressing the personal. My question to you would be, I think I feel that the whole discussion about diversity in the US has been hijacked by this political correctness lobby. So diversity becomes almost like an end in itself, and the underlying issues of justice seem to have been forgotten. And the initial motivation for, say, affirmative action was because it had to do with redressing injustice. And do you think that's a correct observation to make?
I do. I do think that it's a correct observation, and I think one of the things that sort of bothers me about that is that when we see the diversity as the end goal, that it almost sort of lets us off the hook from thinking about how are we challenged to live it out and practice it on a daily basis. And so it becomes something that we can check off as completed, and now let's outsource, right, our sensitivity to otherness on foreign shores. Right, without ever realizing that there is yet work for us to do domestically. And so I think the challenge is, how can we sort of stretch ourselves beyond the domestic without closing off the valve that there's still work for us to do. And I guess what I appreciated about your talk is that we seem to have created this nice little energy between the local and the global. And I think that paradigm works particularly well in a moment, such as this present era that we find ourselves in. So yeah, so I think the challenge is to be globally wise and humanistic in that enterprise, but not to lose sight of the local.
Yes. Do you think it's, I'm asking a second question now.
Go.
Do you think it's harder now to raise the issue of race, given that you have a black president? Has race sort of disappeared off the agenda?
It hasn't disappeared for me, because I feel like I still see, even my narrative, right? Those things, those experiences that I'm bound to experience on any given day here, let me know that race is still a factor. But I think it's very easy to get caught up in the celebration of the moment that we have a black president as if we've arrived. Mm-hmm. And yet for me, when I see, the Tea Party, and something as simple as the pictures in which they used to caricature President Obama, a lot of that steeped in racism, a lot of that steeped in hate, what I would call hate, doesn't really change it. And so I think on some levels it might appear difficult for others because it's almost as if we have arrived. But again, it would bring us back to the local and global, right? Yes. We've arrived on this global scale of what it means to have sort of overcome the unthinkable, the seemingly unthinkable. But yet we have all of these other inequities, right, that we as a society tend to overlook. Yes. So it's not difficult for me, but I think especially the way the media can sort of spin things, right? Yes. On some levels it might make it difficult for others to voice. And maybe for those who feel that it's not difficult to raise those issues or to see those issues, it might be difficult in certain environments, right? Because the media is sort of projecting this wonderful moment, right? And so for you to sort of rupture that with this dissenting opinion, you're probably going against the status quo.
Yeah. I'm always surprised that Americans still use the language of race, which is a 19th century category. We don't use that word in Asia. We talk of ethnic groups. We use the word of communalism. I think that's a peculiarly Indian sociological category, Muslim and Hindu communities, which are ethnic as much as religious. But to me, race is just, biological. We're just one race, Homo sapiens. Why does this language of race persist in America? And do you think it contributes to the problem? Why not simply speak of ethnicity?
Because I think, for me, the way in which race plays itself out in the U.S., I think differs from my understanding of how it sort of plays out in other areas, where maybe ethnicity is more sort of the correct term. But even in my paper, I continually reference the black, I was really sort of theorizing race from a black-white paradigm because I believe that the process of racializing in the U.S. is sort of steeped in that binary of blackness as the other. And so when we begin to look at different laws that have disenfranchised others in this country, you can find its roots, right, in this black and white paradigm. And so I don't think that we've ever really gotten away from that. We see it in culture on so many different levels. And so, yes, there's certainly the ethnicity element that's there, but because this nation, right, is sort of the way in which we talk about difference is steeped in the very racialization along the axis of a black and white binary, I think it's rather difficult to get away from that term.
Yes, so color, physiognomy, as well as ethnicity is important. I see this in India. I often tell my Indian friends, India is the most racist society because you will never see a dark-skinned woman in any television commercial, in any Bollywood movie. All the heroes, all the heroines are fair-skinned. And there are many television commercials which actually target darker-skinned women, offering them fairer skin. So it is really a racist society, even though the language of race is not used. And I think even when you look at the various caste groups, the darker-skinned caste groups are are lower down in the caste hierarchy. And the fairer skinned you are, the more likely you are to get a good position, whether in the private sector or even in government departments. So people don't think of India as a racist society, but it is.
Thank you. Dr. Wilburn, do you have any questions for Dr.
Yes,
Ramachandra?
I was curious from thinking about your talk in terms of, ethnic conflict. How does that challenge the way we might sort of think about ethnic conflict in the States? So like there's a way in which the media our media sort of gives us these very vivid images of what's going on elsewhere. And certainly I believe that there's, agendas there are biases there, so that when we hear words in terms like ethnic conflict, there's a chance that we might be predisposed, right, to sort of interpret it in a certain way. Speaking from outside that lens, how could we sort of gain a clearer vision, right, of understanding what those conflicts mean, not from sort of the imperialist gaze? That makes sense.
Yes, I think conflicts in Asia are extremely complex. I said there are several axes on which people are disadvantaged, and often multiply so. And it's very important to research the history of a particular conflict. And then you move away from these sort of black and white, if you'll forgive the expression, black and white views of conflict, and you realize that we have to recognize these several axes on which conflict happens. So like in my situation in Sri Lanka, there isn't just one dominant community called the Sinhalese, who are predominantly Buddhist and speak the language called Sinhalese, and another community, the Tamils, who are largely Hindu and speak a language called the Tamils. But within the Tamil community, there are 3 or 4 different kinds of Tamils. And not all of them have been fighting for a separate state in the north of the country, where one group of Tamils live. And then even amongst those Tamils who live in the north, there are some who have been fighting alongside the Sinhalese-dominated Sri Lankan army against their fellow Tamils, because they have been bought over by the Sri Lankan regime, given positions of power, often used as paramilitary groups to do the killing in predominantly Tamil areas. And there are many Tamils who have not really even bothered about the suffering of their own people, and yet come to America and talk about the Tamils being an oppressed minority, while they themselves live in great affluence in North America. So this is what makes the situation very difficult to describe to somebody who is looking from outside, who hasn't come and read the history or listened to the different voices. And that is why I said it's so important in situations of conflict to do justice to the other side that your family or your community may traditionally have seen as your enemies, and to actually listen to the way they read the history, and to realize that injustices have been committed by all sides. And it's not a battle of us good versus the evil them, which is, the way conflicts often perpetuate themselves. So like the Sri Lankan regime in recent years has been describing the conflict as a war on terrorism, because by using that language, they thought they could get support from the US and other Western powers. So then that muddies the waters even more, because the underlying grievances, the real discriminations that have been taking place, these are all covered up, and it becomes we, the defenders of freedom and civilization, fighting those barbarian terrorists, those suicide bombers out there. We never stop to think, what is it that forces such people to become suicide bombers? And how can we lessen the attraction of people to, for such acts of terror?
Thank you.
So, well, may I ask another question?
Go right.
Yes, so one of the things that I got out of your response, right, is this need to sort of become educated, right, on our own, right?
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, and yet even in doing that, right, there's a risk. And the risk, as I see it, is you discover knowledge for yourself, right? You discover a different truth, right, that's informed by reading, right? And yet you are existing in a larger community, right, who may not have the access to that knowledge, right, and is operating from all of these other signs that the media or education or friends or family or church is sort of presenting us. How does the individual who has acquired this new truth operate within a larger society that's operating from a competing truth?
Well, I think if you do have larger truth, I mean, you have a responsibility to share that, to raise the awareness of people around you. And it depends on how wide your circle of influence is. But if you do become a local or national politician, for example, you have a bigger circle of influence, a bigger responsibility, and you have to use the knowledge that you have acquired about the global situation to think in terms of the global common good and not just what is good for America or good for Sri Lanka. So that is the responsibility that knowledge carries. So while we live and work locally, we have to think internationally, think globally. And how may our community and our nation be contributing towards war and injustice in other parts of the world? I mean, these are questions we have to ask, however painful the knowledge may be.
Thank you. Can I ask you all just one question? And then we'll go to question and answers. You both were so hopeful, which is great to hear in a society that can be burdened by cynicism and fear. But as you were talking in the context of your hope, and you certainly talked about why it's not working in some cases, I was caught thinking, but it's so hard, and it's not working in so many places around the world, including in our own country. So do you know of places where some of the things that you were speaking of and would like to see happen are happening in ways that we can take and try to move into other places across the planet?
Well, I think he was more hopeful than I was.
I thought you were really hopeful.
I didn't express hope. I mean, everything that I do is motivated by my vision that ultimately the good will conquer, that ultimately God's reign will liberate the earth from its bondage to death and evil. But in the here and now, I have no hope for the situation in which I live. I have no hope for justice and reconciliation in my home country. I don't see signs of hope. I must confess, whenever I come to the US or what I read of the US doesn't give me much signs of hope. I was in Georgia last week in Atlanta. I was told by a professor that 20% of black men in Georgia cannot vote because they have had a prison sentence in their past. And I think it's dreadful that a country that talks so much about human rights does not allow people to vote simply because they have been incarcerated in the past. I would have thought that when I've served my sentence in jail, then I've discharged my duty to society. Why should that stigma be with me for the rest of my life? And for people, including many Christians, simply to accept that and not be outraged by that doesn't really give me much hope for this country.
Thank you.
And I certainly understand that perspective. And I think sometimes in my secret chambers, I find myself having to revive myself from falling there. But again, I think that's why I really tried to focus on the local, because I think we live in an age when we look at any of these issues, it is so daunting to believe that one person can make a difference and clear up all of that. and heal all of that. But your question, Larry, my immediate reaction was, I do see hope. And I see hope every Monday and Wednesday between 2:40 and 4, and between 4:10 and 5:30 when I teach this semester. And that hope, and I take that hope when I get it, right? Does that mean every student in the class is exhibiting that hope? No. But I believe that the work that we do in our classrooms can be life transformative. And if it transforms one individual, there's so many of the readings that I teach that I know is very discomforting for my white students in particular. It challenges and upsets the way in which they saw themselves, right? Because in many instances they're not racist, right? They're hip, they got it together. And some of the readings really probe us in ways that make us see ourselves in new light. And my experience has been several of those students, the reading resonates with it and they wallow in it, they get dirty with it, and they reemerge as new individuals. And as I believe that my teaching, I tell my students all the time, I'm not disillusioned by the fact that the way I teach what I teach will have impacts on at least 2 or 3 generations beyond me. And so when I think about students who have come from my class who are now going into the field of education with this fire to teach a more multicultural curriculum in their classrooms, in their teaching, those types of experience were unheard of when I was coming up. And so I think, well, there's one person, that's one person, and that one person will impact over the course of his or her career how many students. And so I think the hope, it might be in integers, and maybe it's measurable in integers, but that's hope. And so to celebrate the little things, even within the bigness and the daunting nature of what seems such a heavy obstacle.
Great, thank you both.
I'm Victoria. Hi. I have a question for Vinoth. Did I say that right? Vinoth. Okay, sorry. So that last question I'm sorry, what's your name again, mediator?
Oh, Larry.
Larry. That the question that Larry just asked about, is this hope realistic? And, since you guys both are coming from 2 different perspectives, that you're saying, yours is through Christianity and Christ and the power of Christ and the Bible and the truth in that, and yours is from your truth of, equal rights and instilling, independence and hope that can hopefully spark a chain reaction. Vinoth, I'm a little confused by your answer that there is no hope, because what about Jesus in the Bible? I don't know.
There was a Sri Lankan theologian called D.T. Niles who once said, hope begins with the ruin of our expectations. So I was speaking really of our expectations, which is the way that most people would use the word hope. We hope that things are going to get better. There is going to be changed. Now, in that sense, I have no hope. I have no expectation. Nothing, no rational grounds to believe that things are going to improve. But there is hope in the ultimate, transcendent sense that evil will not have the last word. And it is my faith in the resurrection of Jesus that grounds that hope. So in the ultimate sense, I know that, and I affirm it, and I preach it, and it motivates me to persist, to continue to live in a hopeless situation, to still embrace poverty and violence and not run away to places of comfort and security. And in that way, I hope I'm being a sign, a witness to that ultimate hope. But I don't have hope in that rational sense of expecting change either in my lifetime or even in, I don't have children, but say future generations.
So pretty much like because I don't know, I think of hope differently, so that's why I was confused, but pretty much you're saying that you don't have the expectation or really believe that the whole world will eventually know your truth, the truth of the Bible before it's over?
my hope is ultimately in God, in the character of God. But how God is going to bring something good out of the mess, the evil, I don't know. I just cling to God. But how God is going to work in these situations of violence and entrenched poverty and suffering, I don't know. So it is hope in a person, not hope in a program or a method or an institution or a process.
Thank you.
Do you want to comment at all, Reggie? We're just going to alternate sides here, so go ahead.
All right, that's a little bit short. Can you hear me? All right. I had kind of a jointed question. I was wondering more about the relation between individual and communal effort, which we should emphasize. Should we emphasize a more individual level of our daily actions, like the little things, as you were talking about, Dr. Wilburn, or should we emphasize a communal effort in which that we work together to conquer the big things? And also, that effort, what kind of effort should it be? Should it be more of a created equality to where we try to address past grievances, or should it be more of an equal treatment in that we treat ethnic groups equally?
I think I'll start with your second question. I think the project is much more easier if we just think about the word love. I think love will cover a multitude of sins, but love, I mean, if you love anyone, right, I feel equality, right, has to be embedded in that, right? You can't willfully mistreat someone and say that you love them. That wouldn't make sense to me. And so I think if we just take it back to loving, learning how to love others the way we'd want to be loved, I think that could solve so much, right? We don't have to worry about all of the other qualifiers because everything will fall into place. In terms of the individual and the communal, I guess that's a little bit difficult because I get uncomfortable when we talk about binaries in that way. And so I guess on some level, I think if we start with self, and again, it goes back to the scripture that I quoted. I mean, if you can't love yourself, how can you really love others? I mean, in the same way that Christ is asking, how are you going to love me whom you haven't seen, right? And you mistreating the folk that you do see, right? So I think we can begin this walk by first by starting with self, the individual. Because if you can treat yourself well, if you can get yourself together, then you might have a word or a deed for someone else so that the self is existing within communities, right? Even as the community is involving the self.
Dr. Ramachandra, do you want to?
No, I just wonder why you ask a question about emphases. Why do we need to emphasize one or the other? Why not emphasize both?
Well, I was kind of wondering about the emphasis, because how we should practically apply this notion of the dream of ethnic diversity. Because we can talk about ideals, but in reality, we have to make a decision every day what we're going to do about it. And I think we should try to find where we can most effectively focus our energy, whether it be an individual or communal level.
Yes, but like I said, it depends on your particular giftings and your circles of influence, what profession you're in. If you go into the medical field, for instance, you won't be concerned just to treat individual patients. You would also be concerned about raising the general level of public health in society, on raising education, awareness about good nutrition, and so on. It depends on what kind of influence you have, whether as a teacher, whether as a parent, whether as a public government official. So it's not a question that can be answered in the abstract.
Thank you.
And I would even say, right, so going back to my narrative, right, if you can't even say excuse me, to me, that's something very local, right? That's community building right there, right? That's the individual and the community. But in the moment in which you step on my foot and act as if I'm not visible, right? I think the chance for building a community has passed us by, right? Because if I'm interpreting it through the lens of my experience, you are oblivious, right, that you even stepped on my foot or don't care or whatever the factor may be. There's no community there. So in that moment, right, both the individual and the community is implicated. And I think for me, that's why I think it starts with love and it starts with the self, because we don't have to get caught up in the big ideas. Like for me, when I hear community, that's the big idea, right? But if we just started on the local, the individual exists within communities. So if the individual can be right, then the community will fall into place.
Thank you. Yes.
I would just like to say, Dr. Wilburn, probably the most shocking revelation that I learned this night was when you spoke of that your mother, her school was not desegregated until 1970, I think you said, and that to me is shocking as a political science major, because I had learned, that Brown versus Board of Education had fixed everything. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, from a political standpoint, how do you see us moving forward when it's obvious that there is such a huge task ahead, and what role do you see the government playing in the future, in future generations in this issue, and if any, if successful, pushing it forward, or do you think it will be more of a hindrance to it?
I think that's an excellent question, and now I feel like a broken record, because now I feel like I've landed onto something that I think really has resonance. I'm not putting my focus on the government, right? Because we make up the government. We tell the government what to do, right? If we do what we're supposed to do, the local will impact the national. And so when I guess instinctively, now that I'm thinking in this framework, when I hear government, what am I doing, right, to impact government, right? That becomes the challenge. And it becomes challenging because I'm trying to get tenure, I'm trying to teach, I'm trying to be in the lives of my nephews and niece, and my mom's getting older, I got to pay attention to that, and so I have to make these negotiations on a daily basis, right? Which do I choose? But ultimately, I am responsible, as a citizen, I am responsible for the good and the bad of this nation. And so when I hear that aspect of your question, the government, I don't want to make the government the linchpin for what I should be doing. And when I look at the mirror, if I'm not doing all that I'm supposed to be doing as a citizen, then I have to look at myself and reason with that. So there's that aspect. I can't remember the first half of your question, but I think the answer that sort of came to my mind, or the statement that came to my mind was, yet in all of that despair, and see, to me, this is the motivating, inspiring part. In all of the despair of what was my mother's generation experience, she raised two boys to believe that they could do whatever they wanted to do. The fact that I'm on this stage right now, right? I mean, how do you explain that coming from that history? And so I believe that there are ways for us to move beyond the despair, and we must move beyond the despair, right? Because when we think about slavery, when we think about any of the injustices that happen along the axes of race, class, gender, sexuality, physical abilities, and others, we recognize that in as much as those experiences were traumatic, there were people who yet hoped and believed that the future could be different. And we've made changes. We've made some progress, right? And so if we all just caved in and said, oh, woe is me, right, there is no energy to dictate something different.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to thank both of you guys for your talks. They were both excellent, and I think I can speak for everyone in saying that we all enjoyed them. I have three questions, one for Dr. Wilburn, and one for Dr. Ramachandra, and then one for both of you. Dr. Wilburn, you spoke at length about how you have injustice here on campus, and how, like, when you hold the door open for someone, they don't say a simple thank you to you as they walk through. Mm-hmm. Relate to that a lot. It happens to me quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And My question to you is, if you were to go to a different part of the country, say down south or out west, do you think that would be different, or that people would say thank you as you open the door, wouldn't step on your shoes, something like that?
I have lived in several places in the U.S., and I see that phenomenon play itself out rather consistently in the way in which I articulated it tonight. And the other thing that I wanted to say is the speaking thing, right? The speaking on the street, or the not speaking, right? There's another dynamic that I could have talked about, but that would be like a whole nother discussion. Like I see up here, I see that happening even among individuals of color, and that greatly disturbs me. I don't really understand that at all, especially in a space like this. But it means something different. That's a different anxiety for me. That's a different frustration for me. But when I step on an elevator and white women clutch their purses, that tells me something, right? That tells me something about how I'm being perceived. And so I can give you multiple accounts of how these variations play out. And one of the most craziest ones is this, that's why I mentioned this gymnastic contortion. Everything to do but say, excuse me, and I want to know what that's about. I don't understand that. I don't understand that. And it almost never happens to me when I encounter people of color. So I believe there's something there. I don't know what that is. I can theorize on it or speculate on it, but I believe there's something there, and I think it has something to do about race.
Before you ask, could you ask one more question, and then in order to be fair, I'd just like to have folks, and then if we have time, you can ask that third one. Is that okay?
That's fine. My second question was to Dr. Ramachandra. You, when you were introduced to us, we were told that you were on a evangelical Christian board, like that you were a secretary, I believe. Is that correct?
Well, I work with an international Christian organization.
Okay. And I was a little bit concerned, as you said, that you didn't believe that you didn't have hope. And like, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I believe that our hope is that when we go and speak about Jesus Christ to other people, that hope could be instilled in them, and that, like as you, Dr. Wilburn, spoke and said that verse, that when they see our love for other people, they would know that we are disciples of Christ. So I'm a little confused as to why you have no hope now, even though you're on a Christian board.
Well, I thought I explained what I meant by that and what I didn't mean by that. So I think if I were to expand on that, it would be another lecture. So if you don't mind, I'll pass on that.
Yes.
The UK recently announced that they are abandoning all of their campaigning and propaganda, as it were, for multiculturalism, because they believe multiculturalism had failed, because it was said that they thought it seemed like they were losing their cultural identity. Now, I believe that it may be perhaps that they were misdefining multiculturalism in that sense as equality equals homogeny. So my question is, do you believe that each individual subcultural ethnic group should retain their own cultural identities while holding high respect for each other? As in the pursuit of multiculturalism, each of us should not lose our historical cultural identities, yet understand that we have differences and recognize that, but still hold each other in high respect. So my question is, do you believe that's probably more of an accurate view of multiculturalism?
Well, a truly multicultural society would be where everybody learns from everybody else. That means a dominant culture must be open to receiving, learning, being challenged by the new immigrant cultures, which would mean, for example, that white, affluent Americans should be willing to listen to the challenge that, say, Muslim groups put to the hedonism and the individualism that's taken for granted in American life. If we are not willing to listen to that criticism and engage with that criticism, we cannot really say we are truly multicultural. If we are only expecting others to change and become like us and assimilate to our culture, then we are actually not respecting other people and their cultures. So often this talk about our cultural heritage and our cultural values is a way of saying, we don't want to be challenged by you. We will challenge you, but you can't challenge us. That's arrogance. And if you really take the trouble to explore what's called our cultural heritage, historically we have received so much from others. Europe has received so much from the Arabs and from Asia. America has received so much from Europe and China and all over the world. The vast majority of your scientists and engineers here were not born in America. So we have to question who is defining culture, who is defining our heritage, who is defining what we call our cultural values, and question that.
Dr. Wilburn, okay. Thank you. B.
All right. Well, I think one of the things that's important about Dr. King and Dr. King's message is that he preached love for everyone, whether you're black, white, rich, poor, GLGBTQ identified, or straight, heterosexual identified. And I think the problem today is that, particularly with religion and Christianity in America, is that it perpetuates hate. So I guess I would ask you all to speak on how that message of hate that's being delivered by a lot of Christians today, even in Christian organizations on campus, where I've been at LSU, where a lot of Christian organizations perpetuate this message of hate. And even though it's not intentional, that's what the message is being delivered. So then the thing like religion, which is supposed to offer us like salvation for individuals and hope, it's being deferred, and it's telling us that we're going to hell or something like that. So I guess I'd ask both or either person to speak on how that message of hate is being detrimental to Dr. King's, original intent of the dream and equality for everyone. So how religion is being reversed, or.
Thank you. Who wants to tackle that first? Dr. Wilburn.
I guess for me, when I think about the ways in which I have been subject to certain ideologies, or subjected to certain ideologies in the name of religion and or Christianity, and in those moments where I recognize that my position may have been a dissenting one, or one that runs counter to the masses in that group, I've had to recognize that I am my own individual, I am my own thinking individual, and my relationship between God and my Savior is mine and mine alone. And so I can hear the doctrines of others, but it doesn't have to define my truth. And if my truth is wrong, that's going to be between me and my God, not you, me, and God. And so I think ultimately what's at stake is I'm thinking of Hortense Spillers now. I came back from this conference in MLA, right? And she talks about how literature, one of the things that we need to do is to think about literature as this space where we can shore up reserves, right? As a safe haven against the assaults that we will always have with us, right? And I think in that same measure, right, the challenge to be a literate individual, I believe, is to receive the best that has been articulated in society around culture and literature and ideas and philosophy, the best and the worst. We need it all. And to come to a sense of who you are in all of that. And once you recognize what that is and you can look at yourself in the mirror and own yourself, then does it really matter? You can listen to hate, you can listen to things that run counter to who you are, and you know how to respond to those.
Thank you.
I was watching last week on the History Channel a documentary on the civil rights movement, and it was so moving to see many white pastors, ministers, marching side by side with Martin Luther King and the black leaders of the civil rights movement. Now, certainly there were many white churches which opposed him, but there were black pastors who did. And for me, that is a sign of hope. When people see white, black, people of all color, all ethnic, cultural backgrounds actually working side by side. And so this touches on the previous discussion about hope. The church is called to be a sign of hope to the nations. But when the nations look at the church and they see division, fragmentation, Christians unable to love one another, then what message of hope, what message of reconciliation does the church have for the wider world? And that's why I'm troubled when I see these ethnic, homogeneous churches, and even on campuses in America, Christian groups dividing on ethnic lines. There is no justification for such ethnic divisions, for white-only churches or Korean American churches or Indian American churches. These are not churches, these are religious ghettos. They're clubs where people just associate with others with whom they're comfortable. But a church is a place where we are being disturbed. We are being disturbed by a prophetic word that comes to us week after week, calling us to love one another, to accept one another because God in Christ has accepted us. So you need to work hard at demolishing some of these ethnic, homogeneous religious clubs if you are truly to preach hope to this nation and be a sign of hope to this nation.
Thank you. Yes. If you believe, or if we're born into sin and our hearts are deceitful above all else, is it possible for a non-Christian to be able to truly embrace cultural diversity? And on that matter, even, are they capable of truly loving if we're born into sin in a fallen nature?
Well, the Bible does not begin with sin, it begins with creation. That's the first thing the Bible tells us about human beings, that we are all made in the image of God. And it's very dangerous to start your anthropology with sin. Sin is a disordered state of human nature. But because all of us are made in the image of God, and God's witness is there in every culture, in the whole world, human beings are capable of doing things that God desires. But everything that we do, even the good that we do, is always flawed. It's always imperfect. That's sin. But to say that only Christians are capable of pursuing justice and truth and beauty is a denial not only of experience, it's a denial of the biblical revelation. You go through the Gospels and you find Jesus often saying, "Not in Israel have I found such faith." The Roman centurion who was not a Jew. And Jesus associated with people, the lepers, the tax collectors, who were outside the pious religious community. And he said, such people will be there in the kingdom of heaven. And those who think their seats are booked to heaven, they'll be in for great surprises on the day of judgment.
Thank you. Dr. Wilburn.
Yeah, in somewhat of an echo of that, I would say some of the most painful things that have been said to me have come by those who profess Jesus as their Savior. So I think there is no one sort of has the reserve, right, on who can love. I think once you've been loved, once you've experienced the love of someone else, I think anyone can be open to love, regardless of their Christian walk or their walk, their religious walk.
Yeah, we have to say that ultimately every expression of love and justice and truth and beauty has its source in God, whether or not the person acknowledges God or worships God. God is the source of all that is good and true and beautiful, and so we should rejoice wherever we see the light of God shining, even in the darkest human heart.
Thank you. Mr. Arona.
Another student before me alluded to this, but we all hold doors, and we all get snubbed, and we all get bumped, and we all get ignored. And I was nudging my friend next to me. He has 3 sons. I have 5 sons. They're all a bunch of savages. Okay? We teach them not to act like savages. When I had a 4-year-old, he had a habit of saying kumi and barging through wherever he wanted to go. Okay, and kumi it's still a family joke that by saying kumi, you can get anything done. So my question is, Dr. Wilburn, you are a man of privilege, of great education, a PhD, a professor, an assistant professor. If you feel offended by things that we do not take offense at, then what hope is there for less educated people who haven't had the privilege that you've had to move beyond offense?
I think then in that instance, right, well, there are a variety of satellites, right, for dealing with oppression and defense, right? So there are folk who attend, some folk get their inspiration from church, from God, from a belief in a higher power. There are others who have networks, familial networks, social networks that allow them to vent. Sometimes it's like, I just need to go off to myself and process these issues and what these mean for me. I never want to sort of suggest that all is in despair and there's no hope for the world. There's always hope, right? The challenge is not to let these things disturb me so that I fall off course. What I would say is, yes, I'm aware that any of these offenses could happen to anyone here. But given the racist legacy that we've inherited, that we've all inherited here in the United States, what I wish to make clear is that when it happens to me in a black body, it has different resonances, right? So maybe others can just sort of excuse it as rudeness. But for me, given the legacy that we all have inherited, right, and it's because of that legacy I feel we all need to be more sensitive. Right? It's no longer feasible, I think, to simply not say thank you when that's just polite. That would, in my mind, be the Christian thing to do, right? But this sort of carelessness, right? I believe that there has ruptures, right? There are these racialized ruptures and interpretations that I feel are logical, right? Whether they're true or not is something entirely different. The fact is they are logical and they have an impact because of the racism that is our legacy that we all have inherited. And so if we have never thought to think about that, then what I'm saying, here's something for us all to think about.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening. Good evening. Now you can hear me. Okay. I guess I'll just bend down. I have one question for Dr. Ramachandra. And it was a few months before the end of the conflicts in Sri Lanka. BBC did a report on the difference in opinions between Tamil diaspora in England and Tamils in Sri Lanka on the Tamil Tigers. And it seemed to me, at least the individuals that they chose should have been random, I suppose. In England, the diaspora pretty much were in favor of the Tamil Tigers. And when they interviewed the people in Sri Lanka, it was a much more divided opinion. So I was just wondering what perhaps fueled that difference of opinion.
Well, it's very easy when you're not involved in a situation of war, violence, you're outside there altogether, to take a rather romantic, idealistic view of the people who are doing the fighting for your community, because you're not at the receiving end of any of their atrocities. Your children are all safely educated in the best universities in England or America, And so you can have a romantic view of these people as freedom fighters. But if you're actually living in that situation, you see firsthand what these so-called freedom fighters are doing to your children and to other people's children. And they are no different to the army that they are fighting against. And so the people who are living in the north of Sri Lanka were caught between two terrorist armies. And that's what makes the situation more complicated, because it was a conflict that was being fueled financially by people living in the West, the diaspora, so-called, because they were not directly affected by the violence. And that's what happens in a lot of these conflicts in Asia and other parts of the world, that it's those who are outside the war zones who actually profit from what is going on. They profit through business, through arms deals, contracts, or they present themselves as victims, as part of an oppressed community who are in exile in the West, and they can claim refugee status even though they may not be genuine refugees. So it's perfectly understandable, the results of that survey.
Thank you.
And could I add something for Dr. Wilburn, if that's
Sure.
okay? You may look at me and not really see that I'm Hispanic, but inside, I know I'm Hispanic. You know, I was raised mostly in Latin America, and I speak Spanish, and I identify with Hispanics, even though my wife is blonde and blue-eyed. I feel really uncomfortable around police officers, and I've had a couple experiences that kind of have taught me to feel that way. And so I kind of understand where you're coming from when somebody is rude and you feel that it's your outward appearance that they're reacting to. So.
Thank you. And I feel the same way when I see policemen too. I mean, particularly when I'm driving, if the light goes on, I mean, I get palpitations. It's an instant default. I mean, and I am nervous. I mean, by the time they come up to the window, which hasn't happened recently, but by the time they come up to the window, I am like physically shaking, you know, and the sirs start coming out. Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. Right? So yeah, I can identify with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Aiden back up. I'd like to thank, it has been I'd like to thank you all for your thoughtful and articulate and provocative questions, and I'd like to thank Dr. Wilburn and Dr. Ramachandra for really wonderful, and I say hopeful analyses of the world and what we're facing going forward. But in particular, thank you for your time and thank you for being here tonight. And if we could give them a great round of applause, that'd be great.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.